Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome back to the Cherubic Flow channel. This is in our series on the prodigal family. Today we're going to be talking about the first prodigal in the family, which is the younger son. And we find this in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15. If you're not familiar with the story, this is the story of two sons and their father and their interactions. But today we're just going to be covering the younger son. So in Luke chapter 15, we find the younger son who acquires money, his part of the estate from his father, and he goes out and he ends up spending all of it recklessly, exceedingly, and it's all gone pretty quick. And then he ends up in a bad position because he's without food, he's hungry, and he has to make a decision. What's he going to do? And he ends up making the decision to go back home. So we're going to read through the story in Luke 15, and I'm just going to point out a couple details that are important because this younger son represent a part of us. We are that younger son to a degree. We're also the older son, but the younger son is there. And we've all been in this position before as this prodigal son. So let's read in Luke chapter 15. It says, "The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the estate that falls to me.' So he divided his wealth between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country. And there he squandered his estate with loose living." It's interesting that this prodigal son, it begins with the desire for division, a desire to possess what's his own. And it's not necessarily bad to have that desire, but that's some of the folly of being the young prodigal, is that we think we're in a position to handle everything that the Father has for us and is prepared for us, and so we demand that we have possession of it now. But usually what ends up happening is we get possession of it, usually by division or by separation, and then we travel to a distant country. We go to a place we don't know, and we start living loosely. I like that the text says loose living and not just a specific type of living or a specific action that he performed, but loose living. It's not that he set out to do bad or to do wrong necessarily. It's just that he set out to be loose, to be open to anything, to everything. And that's part of that folly of the younger prodigal. I've been in that position. We think that we need to lay hold of these things that are rightfully ours, that we have a claim to. And we need to go out, we need to find our territory in a distant land and establish our own way and establish our own thought, maybe our own identity to some degree. So we're open to a lot of different things. We're open maybe to anything. But in being open to anything, we find ourselves being drained and being zapped of the energy and the resources and the wealth that we've been given. And that's what happens to this prodigal son, because he loses his estate with loose living. Not that I've intended to set out and just blow everything, or that you've intended to set out and go through everything in a month or however long it is. But it's the loose living that sneaks up on us. It creeps us on us, and it takes away from our wealth and from our resources. Verse 14, "Now when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in that country, and he began to be impoverished. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. And he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating, and no one was giving anything to him. But when he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I am dying here with hunger?'" I thank God for the reality of hunger and the reality of our senses. And I thank God for times of famine and that feeling of being impoverished, because those things are reminders. Those things are triggers. Those things are divine moments of mercy in a lot of ways, so that we will be reminded of the goodness of our Father and the goodness of what our Father provides. And this is what happens. He hires himself out just to make a living, just to squeeze by, and he ends up feeding swine. And he was so hungry that he would have eaten what the pigs were eating. But he says, "You know what? I've got to come to my senses. I've got to come to myself." And that's really interesting, because what that reveals is that when the prodigal son, the younger prodigal son, left his father's estate in the beginning and traveled to that distant land, he wasn't really leaving his father. He wasn't really leaving his father's estate. What he was really leaving was himself. And when he's in the pig pen with the swine, what he finds and what he realizes is that he comes back to himself and he realizes who he is and that he has a good father. And so he says this, I will get up and go to my father and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men. So he got up, came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his slaves, and it goes on, but before we continue, that's the attitude of the prodigal son, the younger prodigal son, and why he's the prodigal son. He has expended his wealth. He has expended his best ideas of his own claim to success into his estate. He's recklessly burned through all of it. But he makes a decision to return to the father. But here's the challenge for the younger prodigal. It's this. When you return to the father, when you come back, the father runs out to meet you. He has compassion on you. He embraces you. He kisses you. But the attitude from the shame and the guilt and the condemnation that we feel due to our own actions and to abandoning even ourself and our own senses with our loose living. The challenge is dealing with the attitude of I'm no longer worthy to be called a son. All I can be now is a servant. And that's the lie the enemy will try to ensnare us with and keep us in bondage with, even if we return to our father. The mentality of, even though I'm with my father and I've made it back and I'm no longer in the world in a distant country, now I'm just a hired hand. But that is the lie that the father breaks. That is the lie that the father confronts. That's the lie that the father shows and reveals himself to be utterly against by running out to meet him, by kissing him, by hugging him, by showing him compassion, by embracing him with joy and acceptance and freedom and liberty. And then the father says to his actual slaves, not to the hired son or the servant who's a son, but to his actual slaves, quickly bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and his sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf, kill it, let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. And they began to celebrate. If you've been the prodigal son, the younger prodigal son, overcome that challenge of not being worthy to be a son, because God says to you, you are my son. I won't let you just be a hired hand in my house. And I want to give to you a robe and a ring and new sandals for your feet. And I'm throwing a party just for you so that everyone in my house, everyone in my kingdom can celebrate, because I, as the good father, recognize that you have moved from death to life. You have moved from being lost to being found. And that is a reason for celebration. The goodness of the Father in the prodigal family towards the prodigal younger son is that even if you've squandered everything in a distant world and in a distant land, you can come home, you can return to who you really are, and you can receive a new robe and a new ring and new sandals for your feet, and rejoice and celebrate in the goodness of the Father's house and the party that he's throwing for you. Eat well, live well, be the new you that he's called you to be. This is the blessing that the Father has for you. Don't be ashamed if you felt like that younger prodigal son. Come home and be blessed.